speech and now look to Josh Wallace, Logistics Officer, Jesus College, to open the case for the opposition.
Thank you very much, Madam President. It really is an honour to be speaking in this debate tonight. Last night, as I was getting into bed, I hoped that when I woke up in the morning, lying next to me would be a gorgeous model. I hope that my girlfriend won't kill me for making that comment. Tonight, when I'm in the middle of Park End, 10 to 20 Jaeger bombs in, depending on how poorly this speech goes, I will hope that when I wake up in the morning, my head will be as clear as day. Much to my disappointment, all three of these are false hope. There have been no supermodels spotted in central Oxford. My girlfriend will banish me to the sofa this evening, and my head will be very, very sore in the morning. I want you to keep in mind this evening this idea of false hope, this idea of peddling optimism that I suspect we will hear from the other side, and root your decision in the real-world facts of what we see in front of us, not what we wish to see. Another thing I hoped for this evening was that I wouldn't be met by such a fierce foursome of proposition speakers. Kicking us off this evening was Mackenzie Mulley, a first-year English student at Regent's Park. Mackenzie is a fellow logistics officer and without doubt a future force to be reckoned with on the greasy pole of Oxford Union hackdom. After myself, you'll listen to Dustin Lance Black, a screenwriter, director, producer, and LGBTQ+ rights activist. An Oscar winner in 2008 with the film Milk, and after having a look through his Twitter feed, a seemingly very proud father. In fact, in his Twitter bio, he even has his address from the Oxford Union about 2.5 years ago. And the cynic in me believes that he's only partaking in this debate tonight to draw level with his husband, Tom Daly, and finally give a speech in the main chamber. Also on the proposition this evening is Jasmine O'Connor. She's the CEO of Anti-Slavery International, who worked to end slavery throughout the world with projects in the UK, Europe, Africa, and Asia. To be honest with you, I'm quite surprised that Miss O'Connor is speaking on the proposition this evening, because it seems the last time she had so much hope in something was on December the 12th in the form of retweets about Boris losing his seat and the youthquake carrying Labour to a massive landslide. We all know how that one ended. And last but not least on the proposition is Dr. Maggie Aderin-Pocock, who has presented the fantastic BBC show The Sky at Night. She is an honorary research associate at UCL's Department of Physics and Astronomy and was at Imperial College for both her undergraduate and PhD studies. Unfortunately for me, but I'm sure fortunately for her, I couldn't seem to find a Twitter profile for Maggie. So I suppose all that's left for me to do is ask how it feels to finally be at a first-rate university. Madam President, these are your proposition speakers, and they are most welcome. This decade will be defined by the massive issues we face and our effectiveness to solve them. What I'm going to do tonight is briefly outline the two key but not distinct issues I believe we face, the environment and poverty. And then I'm going to argue that we really do not have the political figures in this country or around the world to drive the urgent action we need to see. But first, I think it's good to have a better idea of hope. My examples at the beginning are clearly distinct from the debate motion this evening. Of course, I hope this new decade is a roaring success, but I don't have hope for it. There's a difference between hoping and having hope. Hoping is wishing for the best. Hoping is waiting to see what happens and hoping it all turns out all right. To have hope, however, is solely grounded in the facts. It's the recognition of these facts and seeing how they come together to get that outcome that you have hope for. Having hope is not what we wish to happen. Having hope is not what could happen if a seemingly endless list of conditions are met. And I suspect this is what we'll hear from the other side this evening. I suspect they'll point to our generation stepping up and solving these issues. But when we look at the facts, the youngest Prime Minister in the last 200 years was David Cameron at 43, and the youngest US President ever was Teddy Roosevelt at 42. The facts say that real political power is not going to be in the hands of this generation, this decade. I suspect they will point to the mass movements that are being created and can pressure our politicians to solve these issues. But we all know that progress is slow, and in order for this decade to be a successful one, we need real steps now. To have hope is rooted in the facts, but it is clearly distinguished from having knowledge of something. Of course, there's still going to be some element of doubt, but I plead with you this evening to question whether you really get that feeling of trust, that this is going to be a successful decade, or do the proposition simply sound like they are wishing for the best? Our planet has warmed just over 1.1 degrees since pre-industrial levels. It is fairly accepted that if this reaches 2 degrees, we will witness climate disaster that we can barely even fathom. On one occasion, every 10 years, the Arctic will have no ice at all. We will see massive crop failure, for example, wheat production falling by 16%, and 3 billion people on the planet will be exposed to water scarcity. This is all before we look at the increase in forest fires, cyclones, flooding. Pick your natural disaster, and we will probably see a massive increase in it. Now, all of this is with an increase of 2 degrees. But if all the countries stick to their commitments made in 2015 under the Paris Accord, it's predicted we'll see a rise of 3 degrees. And this is before the world's second largest polluter, the United States, pulled out. The IPCC suggests that if the entire world were carbon neutral by 2050, we will see global temperatures peak at around 1.5 to 1.6 degrees. Don't get me wrong, at this level we will still see massive climate disaster, but there's a big difference between this and 2%. The question is, however, how well equipped are we to being carbon neutral by 2050? In October last year, a report was released, commissioned by the UK's Committee on Climate Change, that said the UK would miss its own target of net zero emissions by 2050 unless the government took urgent action to change consumer behaviour. This is the 7th richest country in the world struggling to meet the target of net zero by 2050. How can we expect the poorest nations on the planet to reach it when the UK and all its financial might to be able to invest in green infrastructure is currently failing? This decade will see more climate disasters than ever before. That is inevitable. But in order for it to be a successful decade on the climate issue, we need major action now to stop the catastrophe. And this brings me on to my second big issue that we face both as a nation and as a planet: poverty. Almost half the world have a household income of less than $2.50 per day. Now in the UK, I can't even buy one of the Union Bar's fantastically priced debate special cocktails with $2.50. But so what, Josh, I hear you ask? Yes, poverty is clearly an issue, but extreme poverty has been falling for the past 200 years. Why is it a key problem this decade? By 2030, it is estimated that 80% of those living in extreme poverty will live in what is classified as a fragile context. Some characteristics are, yet not limited to, being war-torn, highly impacted by terrorism, and highly prone to natural disasters. Natural disasters which are going to increase in their frequency and intensity as our planet heats up, meaning the poorest in the world will get hit the hardest. These two issues are inherently linked. For years we've made progress on global poverty, slow progress, but progress nonetheless. However, without action this decade, we will see the curve start to turn and the situation worsen in the future. But poverty isn't some alien concept to us in the Western world either. In the UK, we have over 4 million children in poverty, and 70% of these children are in working families. If you're a child in a single-parent family, there's a 47% chance that you will be living below the poverty line. And in the last decade, there's been a 250% increase in homelessness. Something is clearly massively failing in our society, and these people simply cannot afford another decade where this trend continues. All these problems that we must truly believe we can implement and find solutions to if we are to have hope for this new decade. But unfortunately, when I look at politics at home and abroad, I see no one capable of finding and enacting those solutions. I think that it's pretty safe to say that for at least half of the upcoming decade, the UK Prime Minister will be Boris Johnson. And it's highly likely, with such a big majority, that he will be Prime Minister for the whole decade. An Oxford Eton student, journalist turned politician who was born into a wealthy family in New York doesn't exactly sound like the second coming. Now, of course, I suspect those of you who didn't vote for Bojo in the election that I already have you on my side, that he isn't the man to solve these huge issues we face. And for a lot of you who did vote Conservative, I suspect that, like me, it was very much the ABC approach. Anything but Corbyn. Boris, who, when challenged by moderates in his party, simply threw them out. Boris, who tells each separate group he speaks to exactly what they wish to hear. Boris, who's been sacked twice for lying and has cheated on God only knows how many women. He does not give us any hope for dealing with the big issues we need to face in the new decade. In order to deal with the burning issues, our leaders must be challenged and they must tell the harsh truths to those who wish to hear it least. The man who will likely lead this country for the next decade directly goes against what we so desperately need. And as I look around the rest of the world, I see no figures in politics to drive us forward either. If you trust the polls, the US presidential election seems like it will be between Trump and Biden. Trump, a man who simply needs no introduction, and clearly has no desire to face up to the big, burning issues. Famously, he's called climate change a hoax, claimed that all scientists who warned of its risks are politically motivated, and just yesterday called climate change pessimism. Meanwhile, Biden, a vice president under Obama, has pledged a tax on greenhouse gases and to make the US carbon neutral by 2050. Even if someone who is serious about facing up to these big issues gets the keys to the White House in November, the American political system makes radical change very difficult, and even more difficult to maintain without cross-party support. Republican Party candidates receive tens of millions of dollars during each campaign from the fossil fuels lobby. So any change that's brought in will be blocked if they control either house, or simply reversed when they're back in power. There is no solving these issues, especially climate change, if the world's largest economy isn't on board. Maybe the proposition of finding their hope in Mr. Putin, a man who is tightening his authoritarian grip on Russia, allowing less and less scrutiny, and weakening the role of international law. Or maybe their hope is in President Xi Jinping of China, forcibly re-educating Uyghur Muslims and emitting more carbon into the atmosphere than the US and the EU combined, with no sign of this stopping anytime soon. Members of this House, I would love to stand in front of you this evening and tell you that we are going to have a fantastic decade. I would love to stand in front of you and tell you how our leaders are going to work together to solve these big issues that we face. However, I simply cannot. Your decision tonight should be rooted in is's, not ifs. Climate change is a massive risk to all of us. Poverty at home and abroad is going to worsen without action. The world is without effective leadership to deal with these issues, so therefore I urge you to reject this motion tonight.